Hi there, glad you're joining us. It's VRAM time again at PC Games Hardware. After our last test with Radeon cards, this time we're diving into GeForce graphics cards, and I'm confident that this will interest you. You didn't turn me off, which makes me really happy because I've started a long series of measurements, or more accurately, I've just run my standard tests and noticed GeForce graphics cards with 8GB aren't that great either, though they are a bit better than Radeon graphics cards with 8GB. In this video, you'll find out what happens if you now buy a graphics card with 8GB and want to play modern AAA games with it. That might not be a good idea, but thankfully there is a solution, namely GeForce graphics cards with 16GB. And now we're comparing 8 with 16 with some exciting results, and I've got a few recent examples for you, fresher ones, specifically focusing on frame times and overall performance though. The same generally applies to Radeons, to GeForces, and to Arc GPUs, meaning when the memory is full, you'll run into problems. And the issues are usually the same. First, games look worse, getting a bit blurry when turning. There are reload stutters, and only when the memory is seriously full and a lot of data gets paged out to the main memory does it also become very choppy. But when it gets to that point, the memory is nearly full, and you likely don't want to walk that long deep into the swamp. That's why I've essentially taken this task off your hands, or this suffering, and I'll now show you a few examples in the following. They will probably seem familiar to you as loyal viewers. However, it's always the same topic. I'll just show you the current example I found, specifically Monster Hunter Wilds. It just came out. It has a high storage demand, especially if you enable the optional HD textures. It basically never runs smoothly, and it's especially bad on 8GB graphics cards. And yeah, the game makes sure to inform you with a warning message. It's packed with a ton of warning messages, honestly. You must close them all before you can play. I found that quite interesting. When a game throws up a warning like that, there's a reason behind it, namely the VRAM is genuinely running out. And in the background, streaming measures are already being taken to somewhat save the frame rate. Always at the expense of image quality. I'll have Monster Hunter ready for you as a benchmark or frame time comparison right away. That's why I'll keep going. I'll just move straight onto my standard benchmarks for now. As you know from us, we've been testing graphics cards recently since 2025 with 20 rasterizing games, 15 ray tracing titles, and also 8 path tracing games included. Though I'll skip the latter here since we're discussing graphics cards that are currently not costing 4 digits and they do have issues with that. So path tracing on graphics cards under €500, not such a good idea. Let's just skip that for now and focus on rasterizing instead. I'm testing with a GeForce RTX 4060 Ti, either the 8 or 16GB variant. Not surprisingly, you've seen the topic. And why am I doing this? Simply because these graphics cards exist and I want to tell you which of the two is more recommendable. The important thing to note is that new GeForce graphics cards, specifically the 5060 and 5060 Ti, will be released soon. I won't get ahead of myself, that's a whole separate topic coming right after the benchmarks, with some exciting things to discuss. The following benchmarks all involve a direct comparison between the RTX 4060 Ti 8GB and the Ti 16GB. And in this case, it's like this. The two graphics cards, unlike the Radeon cards, are practically identical, except for the memory size. In my benchmarks, I made sure to check. The clock speed also practically the same. So both graphics cards run at around 2730 MHz boost. That's pretty much the level of a good, non-overclocked graphics card, like the Gaming X Slim here. With 2730 MHz, both graphics cards have a pretty decent FP32 performance of nearly 24 teraflops. That certainly allows you to do something, but these are also graphics cards in the range of 400 to over 500 euros. Sadly, this GPU has gotten much more expensive, but it's still interesting. And actually, I wanted to provide you with these values weeks ago, but then AMD, Intel, and Nvidia all thought, let's just release 7 new graphics cards. That's why it got a bit delayed, but exciting in terms of the upcoming GeForce graphics cards. So everything's the same with these GPUs, except for the memory capacity they offer. One has 16GB, the other has 8GB, but they perform equally fast. This means all the differences I'm showing you now come solely from the memory size. In these benchmarks, I've defaulted to WQHD 1440p. As always, you can check out the other 3 resolutions we're testing. I just thought WQHD is a good use case for these cards, maybe also Full HD in most cases, but in WQHD the differences are greater, which is why I've now displayed WQHD. Let's jump straight to the numbers, where 2 cards are highlighted, the Ti 16GB and the Ti 8GB. To make things a bit more exciting, I've placed the results with the biggest differences at the start of the benchmarks themselves and everything that's a bit more mundane, meaning 8GB is sufficient at the end of the set, so we'll focus first on the more exciting things. Starting with Horizon Forbidden West. This was a game that has already made a very noticeable mark as a memory hog on rating graphics cards, even though, fun fact, it's a PlayStation 4 game. But of course, it's been heavily revamped, especially for the PC version. Here you can see the 4060 Ti with 16GB manages a decent 51 frames per second on average, while the Ti 8GB is limping along at below 37 frames per second. I just hovered over it with the mouse, and we can clearly see the percentage gain is 39%. That's not bad. In fact, I'll mention this often in the video, all thanks to the memory. Just for fun, let's take a brief look at Full HD. It's not as extreme, only 25%, but still quite noticeable. As I mentioned earlier, just look at its placement in the benchmark set. This is where the memory really makes the most impact. Let's check the second case, Dragon Age the Veilguard, in WQHD. And there I cranked everything up again, namely the field of view and the textures as well. The big card is running at 32 frames per second, which is playable but not ideal. It's not Counter-Strike after all, so it's fine. And the small one at 26 gives a plus of at least 24%, just because of the memory. Stalker 2 is really extreme. Did I sort that wrong? I did sort that wrong. Stalker 2 is actually one of the most extreme examples. We can see in WQHD the small card is completely dead. I should mention, the game received several patches in recent months. It runs a bit better now. It's also more memory efficient. Still, it won't make a difference for 8 GB graphics cards. Only with 12 GB cards does it reach a decent level, avoiding a complete performance crash. But with 8 GB in Zalicia, where there's a lot going on, it's still very demanding. And as you can see, it's 31 to 11 FPS, so I'd say the 16 GB card is a bit faster. Enshrouded, a game made in Germany with Vulkan API, is really exciting. It's not your typical everyday game. Here it's less extreme, but you can still see clear differences between 8 and 16 gigs. However, we're looking at around 26 to 22 FPS here, which is a boost of 16%. And then, at the latest now, we're approaching the range where 8 GB is sufficient in most cases. And I have to say, 8 GB for rasterizing. We're only discussing rasterizing here. In ray tracing, we'll see that it actually requires much more memory. But you can keep as an interim conclusion that if you buy an 8 GB graphics card, you can still get by with 8 GB in AAA games, provided you limit yourself to Full HD and B, leave out ray tracing. Both individually and especially in combination definitely cause 8 GB to burst. Feel free to check it out. I'll quickly click through a few more games. You can see it very clearly here. The graphics cards are exactly as one would expect, running at the same clock speed. It delivers identical performance, resulting in mostly the same FPS overall. No surprise. But in some games the cards are so slow I have to scroll down. But no differences between the two. It's not exciting, so let's move on to the performance index. When you compress all the data, stuttering and smooth running games, into a performance index, this is the result. This is the overall index, and it becomes quite clear that 8 GB is mostly sufficient. So if you look at it like that, you might think 8 GB is enough. But I've told you multiple times I can only evaluate the objective part, which is the FPS. When games start reducing details or don't allow maximum details, something like Dragon's Dogma 2, more on that in a moment, then it's not in the rating. I can only measure FPS. So the 16 GB card here is the only one in this duel that shows everything and hits max performance. With the 8 GB card, the game's streaming systems frequently have to make compromises, which sometimes results in noticeable blurriness to ensure the frame rate stays stable. In the overall index, you can see that the 4060 Ti 16 GB has a lead of 9%, which comes from the games you just saw that don't run as well. However, if you take a look in Full HD, it's not quite as extreme. There, the difference is only 2%. Simply because the 8 GB is sufficient in most cases. I also need to add here that I'm not doing benchmarks for 3 hours straight. If you're playing something, having a longer session, I don't know, in Monster Hunter Wilds or Assassin's Creed Shadows, which just came out, then you'll be exploring new worlds. You'll frequently end up loading save games when you die, which naturally results in new data being added to the memory and so forth. And that's when, sooner or later, you'll run into a memory overflow. And you'll notice it, among other things, through longer loading times, the mentioned MUD, and occasionally the odd reload stutter. That doesn't happen if you've bought a device with 16 GB, because there's always a buffer available. As a side note, I'd like to show you the full picture, what I typically see at the test system with all the memory overflows and erratic results. However, I'll filter that for you, so what you see here are the results that are plausible. Not the outliers. There are always many more outliers on the 8 GB cards. However, these are sporadically. Also, my test system is quite clean. At home, you likely have a browser open, maybe Discord and such. That's all stuff running in the background and maybe taking up a bit of memory. Therefore, my benchmarks still show the best case scenario for 8 GB graphics cards. In real-world practice with many active applications, you'll probably want to have a bit more buffer there. And all roads lead to buying a graphics card with at least 12, preferably 16 GB. But I'm getting off track again. Let's get back to the performance index. In this case, I want to show you Ultra HD. Not really practical with these GPUs, they're just too slow. However, I do want to show what happens in that case. The expected outcome. The larger frame buffers occupy a fixed area in the memory, which means there's not as much room for texture streaming and the games stutter more. We can see that here. The plus increases to 19%, and in even higher resolutions or more modern games that will be released throughout the year, it's likely to be even more noticeable. Doom the Dark Ages, it's probably even larger than shown here. You might notice I'm not strictly following a script or plan here. I'm sharing a bit from behind the scenes what I usually see with this test system. I honestly can't recommend an 8 GB graphics card to you, especially if you like ray tracing or want to give it a try. because when you buy a graphics card that costs around 500 euros, you might actually consider using ray tracing. Even the consoles can handle it. Let's check out what happens when you turn on ray tracing in a modern game using an 8GB GPU. Not so great. Here in Forza Motorsport, the 16GB 4060 Ti is displayed for the 8GB version. I'll scroll down, it's stuck at 16.5 frames per second, and that's only WQHD. And we can see the large card manages 44. 44 compared to 16.5 is an increase of 167%. In other words, the larger version is almost 3 times as fast just because of the memory. And here, my benchmarks are being kind once more. So with a few more track changes or additional races, the 16GB card would pull even further ahead, simply because the 8GB card can't manage its memory efficiently. And in this case, in full HD, thanks to my short measurement phases, the 16GB variant is only ahead by about 41% ahead. Only. Still quite significant. What I experienced while testing these cards, if you then select a few other tracks, meaning load new textures, have different participants, there are huge nasty drops in between. If you restart the game, it improves and gets worse again. In Alan Wake 2, a totally different genre, but the performance looks quite similar, with an overall lower FPS level throughout. Here we see the small variant with 8GB, sitting at a modest 14 frames per second, and the larger one at around 29. Neither is great, but you can see where things are heading. 8GB is definitely not enough, and the bigger card is twice as fast. Same deal, just with a bit more FPS. That's pretty much exactly how it looks in Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. I've got to address that again because I keep hearing, well, the game doesn't even need the memory. Well, yes and no. I mean, you can always reduce the texture pool, and in most cases you won't notice much of a difference. However, if you set it to low, for example, you'll not only get blurry textures in the distance, but also when looking around and up close. So it's not a third-person game like Tomb Raider, but it's first-person. When the wall looks like a blurry pile of pudding, that's definitely not ideal. And that's why texture pool on high ensures maximum texture quality. However, it requires a certain amount of memory, and 8GB graphics cards simply can't handle it. Sure, you might downplay it, saying you can reduce the texture pool, but if you're buying something new, and I'm advising specifically for new purchases, definitely skip the 8GB card, because you're really limiting yourself. Dragon Age is great too. It was brutal with rasterizing, one of the few games that actually maxes out 8GB. With ray tracing, it gets tougher because of the extra data involved. The data structure for ray tracing also needs to be set up and maintained. And then things like that happen, the big card is 85% faster. That's already pretty insane. Cyberpunk is one of those cases that still runs pretty well with rasterizing, even after several reloads. Well, it's really playable on GeForce graphics cards with 8GB, until you turn on ray tracing. In that case, we have a minimum of 16 and an average of 29 for the smaller card. And the larger one doubles the amount of P1 FPS here. On average, it is 38% faster. Wow. You can already see several games with ray tracing clearly differentiate 8 from 16 gigs. Ratchet & Clank is another tough case. It doesn't run so well on GeForce graphics cards with 8 gigs. It's really no fun at all. Try precisely jumping around with 21 P1 FPS. It's just flat out awful, while the big one's 32% faster. It's already pretty clear. In Witcher 3, it's similar, which is why I'll quickly show you the games where it's not quite as extreme. F1, for example, is one such case. 8 gigs works, not ideal, but it still manages to run. Star Wars Outlaws actually runs decently enough with 8GB for performance, but the game becomes a lot uglier. The other games we can pretty much ignore since not much is happening there. With Star Wars Outlaws though, I do want to mention that it's a game that actually runs pretty well because it constantly checks to ensure the memory doesn't overflow, and it reduces texture details accordingly. Without being asked, you can't change it. The frame rate is preserved, but the image quality takes a hit. As expected, the gap between the 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB grows. And specifically, from 9% in rasterization to a substantial 25% in ray tracing. And I also don't want to leave out that the overall index makes the extent clearer than, for example, full HD. There, the gap is only 14% entirely due to the memory. This means, especially with ray tracing, you should ensure the graphics card has more than 8GB, or you'll run into performance issues. With higher resolution, it gets even worse, so I'll show you the 3 higher resolutions again. And now a clear focus on Ultra HD. It's not practical, but still fascinating. Here we see the gap between the 2 increases to 35%, and that's with the same computing power. Now to focus on the big picture, the detailed analysis. The 4060 Ti is now my 100% in this calculation. So we set the baseline performance and then we look at how the 8GB variant performs relative to it. What it delivers in comparison. Here we can spot clear differences. Starting with rasterizing, where 8GB is mostly sufficient. And if you take a look, there are quite a few games. So I used the color yellow for those games below 97%, figuring it would make it stand out more clearly, down to 92.4% relative performance. There are a few games, as you just saw, where it's not quite as extreme. There are mild performance drops and also mild quality losses, which unfortunately I can't factor in for you here, but they do exist in addition to the FPS drops. And there are certain games that perform significantly worse when the memory overflows. And those are the orange and red colored games. Let's switch over to ray tracing. There are fewer games, but significantly more colors that aren't green. Take a look here. The full picture shows very few games left, and that number is growing daily with even more ray tracing titles running flawlessly on an 8GB graphics card. Some of them do weird things, as I just mentioned. Dragon's Dogma is a really important case because it's such a trailblazer. This game starts off by complaining on 8GB cards, saying there are little issues. What it doesn't say is details are cut, so they're being left out. The geometry isn't as nice anymore, it's just flat. If the memory isn't sufficient, then there's nothing you can do about it. Thankfully, that's still the exception. Usually just texture details are reduced, but Dragon's Dogma is really radical in that regard. The other games are honest, at least for the most part. They just end up running like crap, plain and simple. And there you see I've colored them red. It isn't that great with 8GB. It's definitely worth investing in a graphics card with more memory. Unfortunately, you don't have the option to simply choose the Ti with 12GB. Because for technical reasons, it doesn't exist. You only have the choice between 8 and 16. And 16 is clearly the better option here. Because it was so nice, or not nice, I've extracted a few frame times here for you to look at from the standard benchmarks and 2 fresh frame time examples with Spider-Man 2, Patch 5, and Monster Hunter Wilds, latest version. Both are memory hogs. More soon. Let's start with Stalker 2. It's really nasty. This is the worst case scenario in Zalicia, with plenty of dudes running around and a bunch of small houses scattered everywhere. This is the worst case. It needs a lot of memory, tough even for the CPU. In the forest, it's milder. 8GB works, but you'll need to visit the city. You have to sell stuff there and things like that, and there's no way around it. And there you'll notice it's ridiculously bad with 8GB. You see here I've highlighted the 8GB variant in all the frame times in green. So you can see this zigzag pattern means a huge variance between individual frames, which you don't want. Nasty juddering. The 16GB card, on the other hand, remains consistently steady at, around 40 milliseconds. It's not super smooth, but with consistent juddering, it's actually pretty good playable. The second example is Forza Motorsport. This was the case that benefited the most from 16GB in terms of ray tracing. Both graphics cards stutter in a strikingly similar manner, just at entirely different levels. So the frame progression is very similar. There you see the 8GB variant, which isn't that terrible at all. So no reload stutters to break your immersion or ruin your best time. However, it's significantly jerkier compared to the 16GB variant, which operates within a range of roughly 14 to 19 milliseconds. So, running noticeably smoother. Now let's dive into the 2 brand new games launching in 2025. It's also important to take a look because I keep saying that games are becoming more demanding, and they definitely are. Games are currently being specifically designed for the PS5 and the PS5 Pro, and the future is only trending upwards. We'll see that latest with The Last of Us Part 2 for PC. It's coming out soon. Anyway, here you see Monster Hunter Wilds in the current version in WQHD with DLSS performance and single frame generation. So the normal frame generation you get on RTX 4000. And I overclocked both graphics cards a bit. Kind of in joyful anticipation of what I'm about to tell you regarding the RTX 5060 Ti, but more on that later. Here we can see that the graphics cards achieve very different results, and that's exactly what I want to show you. I didn't tweak anything, just maxed out everything in the game, including ray tracing, and we see the large card hitting 71 FPS, while the small one reaches 55. For the percentile, it's quite similar, with figures of 40 to 49 FPS, so the large card is definitely superior to the smaller one. What you can also see, though, is that it doesn't run super smoothly on either one, and that's simply because the frame distribution isn't great here with FrameGen. Why that is, I can't say. In any case, with the memory buffer, you definitely gain better performance overall in practice, and if you were to set a frame cap, for instance. At 60 on the Ti 16GB, you would have a noticeably smoother experience here. Spider-Man 2. I wanted to share that it's running much better now than a few weeks ago. The game had a rough start with Spidey swinging jerkily through the city, but after the 5th patch, it's improved a lot. So it really is, although you don't necessarily see that in my frame time graph, because I decided to run a FrameGen benchmark. Still, there's a noticeable gap between 8 and 16GB, and that's simply because the game, much like its predecessors, demands a lot of VRAM. In my WQHD settings with DLSS performance, similar to Monster Hunter, roughly 12GB are allocated. That means significantly more than 8, and in that case what happens is the smaller card achieves an average value of 50, P1 is at 34, and the big card reaches an impressive 47 P1 and almost 68 FPS on average. And there, both are lagging quite noticeably. Over time, it's clear that it's not perfectly smooth and fluid. However, the big card is, as I said, clearly superior, and the huge spikes up to around 70 milliseconds are absent. So it's definitely more fun. And yes, to minimize the stuttering with the smaller card, you really need to significantly reduce the details. Taking a closer look at the evaluation or expanding the perspective. When comparing the new values of GeForce graphics cards with the Radeon models, some key differences become noticeable, namely GeForce graphics cards, and even here I'm not telling regular viewers anything new, they squeeze out a bit more out of their given memory. This means a GeForce graphics card with 8 GB behaves roughly, don't take this too literally, behaves roughly like a Radeon or Arc with 9 to 10 GB. This means if there are already severe memory-related issues on Radeon cards, GeForce cards can squeeze out a bit more. They're a bit more resilient, so you can do a bit more with them, reload the level a bit more often, or maybe set the resolution just a small step higher before they completely collapse. However, it's not like Nvidia can magically fix all the problems, they can only push them off for a bit longer than originally anticipated. In other words, a GeForce graphics card does slightly better with 8 GB, but even there, it's reaching its limits. Without a doubt, I can't in good conscience recommend a graphics card with that capacity. Now that that's been said, let's take a little look into the future. New mid-range graphics cards are on their way soon, from both Nvidia and AMD, with the Blackwell RTX 5000 series likely to arrive first. There's no official information yet. However, there's a ton of rumors, and I've gathered them here and there, mixed them with a bit of speculation, and what came out is the following table. Here's what you're seeing. On the far left, that's the only model coming soon that, in my opinion, is truly making sense. Because in a way, that's the successor to the 4060 Ti 16 GB, which we just had in focus, the 5060 Ti 16 GB. As you can see, it's mostly similar to its predecessor just now with Blackwell generation. So there's no groundbreaking advantage here, but it does bring some notable improvements that help make this card a bit more robust. First, PCI Express 5.0. Still presumably with only 8 lanes, but double the transfer rate at the slot. It helps when memory overflows, which is less likely with the 16 GB card. And at its core, there are additional shader ALUs and the usual improvements as we've seen with Blackwell. It's a stronger core overall, which is why this graphics card might even be faster than what my numbers here suggest. With the expected clock rates, but this is pure speculation, this GPU has roughly 9% more GPU performance compared to the 4060 Ti 16 GB, plus the Blackwell advantages in general. And above all, this graphics card has a significantly higher memory bandwidth, namely 56% more thanks to GDDR7. It's likely to be a graphics card that is probably around 20 to 25% faster than the 4060 Ti. That puts it almost in the range of the 4070. Quite exciting. Now let's move on to the very speculative part because there have been some strange rumors lately, specifically about a 5060, which allegedly has 12 GB. Let's put that into perspective because this graphics card is definitely within the realm of possibility. Technically, it's possible. I actually don't expect it to exist, unfortunately, because this graphics card requires specific memory, namely the so-called 24 gigabit memory chips. With these, you could indeed attach 12 GB to a 128-bit interface. Instead of 8, it works, on laptops too. The 5090 uses 1.5 times chips. So technically it would work. Unfortunately, I'm assuming that this graphics card is a hoax because this memory is still quite new and therefore potentially very expensive. It's GDDR7 cutting edge. Likely, they don't want this card shown like this. If that's the case, it would finally be a step in the right direction. Otherwise, if this graphics card comes out again with 8 GB and ends up being a direct successor to the 4060, then it would result in the same computing performance and memory transfer rate. I've prepared that right here for you. Based on the clock speeds I assumed, the new card delivers almost 20% more computing performance and a whopping 65% more memory bandwidth. Honestly, I think it's all a bit misguided because this generation really needs more capacity, not more memory bandwidth. Because the latter is rarely the limiting factor, it's usually the computing power. What have we learned today? 16 is more than 8, you already knew that. However, I've just provided fresh evidence here, and I didn't even have to put in much effort. What you've seen, the 20 benchmarks for rasterizing, the 15 for ray tracing, these are my standard benchmarks, just appealing games in demanding scenes, and that's where you get exactly what you can expect. 8 gigs are still okay in many cases, but they're far from being worry-free or truly ideal for smooth performance. Those days are over, the Earth has moved on, the games have gotten prettier. That's why my advice is, if you're buying a new graphics card, you should definitely steer clear of 8 GB. That won't change either. Even in a world where Nvidia manages, through market dominance and market share, to say, okay, we're now incorporating all the fancy new neural materials with new AI texture compression or texture generation, and a huge amount of storage would be saved. Even in that scenario, developers wouldn't use it to save on storage space, but rather to enhance the quality while keeping the storage requirements unchanged. In the end, games become much prettier, but still stutter just as much on 8 GB cards, no doubt. However, to be fair, and this comes out in every test series anew, Nvidia gets more out of the given memory than AMD and even Intel. An 8 GB GeForce handles the data load significantly longer than comparable competitor models. That's why my advice is to rather spend a bit more cash, even if it hurts, and enjoy it for much longer, in fact for years to come. With a 16 GB card, you're definitely well equipped. That was part 2 of the VRAM advice for 2025. And you can pretty much conclude that 16 GB is fantastic. Not in the ultra high end, since there you can do path tracing and Ultra HD. There, 16 gigabytes is definitely not worry-free anymore. However, in the mid-range and high end, it's a good capacity that matches the GPU's performance. And if you also think that more people should know about what we're doing here, then share it with the world, because the world should know. I'll see you next time. Bye.